Oh, it's gonna be hot today. It's great. Like it's already so warm out there. It's awful. Some of us were complaining about it earlier. I'm like, and it's only gonna get worse as the week goes on. I'm all mad about it. I'm like, no, it's time for cold weather, right? This morning was walk to school day for our kids. And so they were so excited because I set up all these lights. I had to hire an electrician to fix my lights because I set up so many of them I blew a fuse. And but I had everything lit up and all the kids were like, ooh, they walked through, this tunnel that covers the sidewalk. And all the kids were so excited this morning. But it was so windy, all my inflatables were flying everywhere. It's crazy. I was thinking I should be careful mentioning inflatables in here, but Halloween inflatables, decoration. Anyway, I wrote that up there. We talked about it a lot last time, right? We went over the menu and the different options, but don't forget that that first homework assignment is due Monday. Okay, so I'll remind you again on Monday because it's not due till the end of the day that day. But it is coming up. Remember, you're just picking one option, right? So you're going to pick another one down the line in November, but just one for now. And I look forward to what you do. If one of them sounds really fun, but it's too big, plan it for the next one, right? Like if it's going on a field trip somewhere and it's too much to do for this one, you can always do it next time. Were there any questions at all about that? Yeah. No, as long as it's related to something that we've covered in here or will cover, it's totally fine. Okay? Yeah. Anybody else? Anything else? Okay. All right, so we'll look at chapter 3, which is communication, kind of like stereotyped male-female communication patterns. A lot of stereotypes in this chapter. And then we'll build on that with chapter 7, which is looking at love and the different elements of like falling in love and the chemicals involved in falling in love. So those are our next 2 chapters. And this one, I think, even though it's riddled with stereotypes, I do think it's really interesting. And we'll look at some like typical patterns and typical struggles that a lot of like male-female communication patterns will face. So when we're talking about communication, just to like kind of broadly define that, we're talking about trying to convey meaningful information. Now, we obviously can convey a lot of information verbally, just like I'm doing right now. Like you can listen to me saying stuff, speaking to you, conveying words, but we can also convey a lot of stuff non-verbally. And one could argue that we convey more non-verbally than we do in the things that we actually say. I don't know if any of you like to people watch. I love to people watch. Like, I think it's fascinating. I think it's the like psychologist researcher in me. Like, I love it. Right. And you can tell so much from body language, right? Like, have you ever had somebody walking toward you and you can tell that they're in an awful mood before they've even opened their mouth? You can tell because of their body language, right? Like, I walked up to practice yesterday. My father-in-law was sitting there and I could tell he was in an awful mood before he even opened his mouth. And it was totally true. Luckily, he turned it around. But you can tell a lot by the way that people like carry their body, their eye contact or lack of eye contact. It fills in a lot of gaps in our verbal communication. And it's huge in relationships. And it's something that we pay a lot of attention to. You know, how close do you stand to somebody? Are you touching or not touching? What is your eye contact like? Are you rolling your eyes in contempt or not? Right? All of these little nonverbal cues can tell us a ton about what people are feeling, thinking, and kind of the quality of a relationship as well. And I found so many entertaining images, I had to really limit myself. But here, just as an example, right? Couple 1, couple 2, right? So like smiling and open and touching each other versus backs to each other and arms crossed. Now, some people cross their arms out of comfort, but it can also be indicating being closed off and angry, bless you, right? So kind of back to back versus very open, facing each other, smiling, very open, like body language, versus kind of more like contempt, right? Which we'll talk a little bit about, like eye rolling, and so on. I found so many more, but 4 more and that's it, right? So sitting very close together on a couch, right? Kind of open, an arm around each other, versus at opposite ends of the couch. This is a really interesting one in therapy. When I was a couples therapist for a period of time, you would always look at, where do people sit? Do they sit like next to each other or is there space? Because that can indicate like how well things are going in their relationship. or it could just be a preference for physical space, which everybody has kind of a different level of comfort. And the last one, right? Again, eye rolling and contempt, right? So these nonverbal cues can tell us a ton, right? And so it's something that we pay a lot of attention to, and it can also be a little bit gendered, which we'll talk about as well. So the focus of this whole chapter is really on the ways that like men and women stereotypically communicate. Now, this is again super stereotyped. Some women are going to communicate much more like in a typical masculine way, and some men in a much more feminine way. And then a lot of people combine both and break all norms, right? But we'll look at some kind of common stereotypes and ideas. And there are two really big kind of books or theorists that look at this. But before I talk about that, I have a scene that I want to play for you. I don't know how many of you watched Wednesday, right? My kids loved it, right? And so we've watched it, I want to say 14 times or something awful. I liked it the first 2 times. After that, right now they're like obsessed with Lemony Snicket, so they've moved on. But it was Wednesday for a time. But I love that scene, right? As I was watching that, I'm like, oh my gosh, that's so this chapter, right? Like that she spends all this time like talking to him and like kind of subtly flirting with him, completely missed by him the entire time. And so she kind of snaps at him at the end and tells him, he's like, oh, right? And I think that is such a great example of like that stereotypical like male-female difference, right? Of like women oftentimes kind of hinting at things, men sometimes needing to be hit over the head with things. Again, these are stereotypes, but they can be very true at times, right? And I imagine a lot of you have experienced some of these moments that we'll talk about today, and we could talk about that as well. So as I mentioned, there are 2 kind of big theorists, 2 big books that were written. These are very pop culture books. This one's a little more rigorous. The person who wrote this one is, her name's Dr. Deborah Tannen, and she popularized a term that she called genderlect. So we have a dialect, right? We can talk about dialect and like differences in communication patterns. Genderlect talks about the fundamental differences between the ways that men and women communicate. And so she spent a lot of time looking at some of these fundamental differences and how they can cause problems in relationships, right? When you have somebody who communicates very stereotypically one way versus another, it can lead to some issues, right? So some of the things that she kind of talked about in her book, one of them is this idea versus rapport talk versus report talk, that women tend to be more rapport focused in their talk, right? They're focused on relationships and connections versus men more report. Like, here are the facts, here are the details, like almost like they're giving a report in a way, right? So kind of a big fundamental difference in the focus of communication. She said that women are more likely to use tag questions, disclaimers, and hedge words in the way that they communicate. So like a tag question is when you add a question at the end of something, like it's really hot out today, isn't it? Right? Like you're kind of like confirming at the end, right? And a disclaimer, like I might be wrong, but it's really hot out today, right? I'll use the same example. And then hedge words are like kind of, maybe, sort of, right? Almost like you're undermining a little bit, like being afraid to assert yourself because it might be a threat to connection and rapport. Also talked about the difference between what she called community and contest, kind of the same idea that women avoid conflict a lot of the time because it's a threat to community and connection and relationship, versus men view conflict as a way of like contesting things and establishing dominance and power and knowledge and status. So these are just some of the things that she kind of summarized in her book, some very common like male-female patterns and differences. The other book that's super popular, Men Are From Mars and Women Are From Venus. And both of these are a little bit older, but they're kind of like hallmarks in the field of this like gendered communication stuff. And what John Gray did, Dr. Gray, who wrote this book, he took like a metaphorical stance that women are from one planet and men from another planet, right? It was kind of like this like big metaphor that he used throughout the book, that we're supposed to be different because we're from different places. And we forgot that somewhere along the way, right? I'm going to play the intro of the book for you. It's just maybe, I think it's a couple of minutes long, but it summarizes kind of his main idea, and then we can talk about these up here. So it's just audio, but let me play that for you. So this is the main premise of the book. It's about 2.5 minutes.
Harper Audio presents Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus by Dr. John Gray. Imagine that men are from Mars and women are from Venus. One day long ago, the Martians, looking through their telescopes, discovered the Venusians. Just glimpsing the Venusians awakened feelings they had never known. They fell in love and quickly invented space travel and flew to Venus. The Venusians welcomed the Martians with open arms. The love between the Venusians and Martians was magical. They delighted in being together, doing things together, and sharing together. Though from different worlds, they reveled in their differences. They spent months learning about each other, exploring and appreciating their different needs, preferences, and even behavior patterns. For years, they lived together in love and harmony. Then they decided to fly to Earth. In the beginning, everything was wonderful and beautiful. But the effects of Earth's atmosphere took hold. And one morning, everyone woke up with a peculiar kind of amnesia. Selective amnesia. Both the Martians and Venusians forgot that they were from different planets and were supposed to be different. And one morning, everything they had learned about their differences was erased from their memory. And since that day, men and women have been in conflict. Without the awareness that we're supposed to be different, men and women are at odds with each other. We mistakenly assume that if our partners love us, they will react and behave in certain ways, the way we react when we love someone. Men mistakenly expect women to think, communicate, and react the way men do. Women mistakenly expect men to feel and communicate and respond the way women do. We've forgotten that men and women are supposed to be different. As a result, our relationships are filled with unnecessary friction and conflict. Clearly recognizing and respecting these differences dramatically reduces confusion when dealing with the opposite sex. When you remember that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, everything can be explained.
Okay, so that's the main premise of the book, right? Again, this idea that we're almost from different planets. Obviously we're using that as a metaphor here, but that men and women are fundamentally different, right? And that if we are aware of that, then we can work with it. And if we're not, then it creates problems, right? Really interesting book. As a side note, it talks a lot about these stereotypical patterns and then the fights and issues that can come from them and how to navigate them. Right, so really cool, easy read as well. But he talks about a couple of different things that are kind of some bulleted main points here. That oftentimes one struggle that men and women have is listening versus offering advice. I love this one, right? It's something that a lot of people I think can relate to. That sometimes people, women stereotypically want to just be listened to, right, and kind of vent something or talk about something. And men oftentimes want to offer advice and fix it, right? And that this can be a fight that people have of I don't want you to fix it, I just want you to listen, or vice versa. Really kind of easy strategies. Do you want me to just listen, or do you want me to try and fix this, right? And you can ask a question like that. But that's something he talked a lot about, that men and women deal with conflict differently, right? That men want to go to their caves and retreat and be alone, and women want to talk. And that can, again, cause problems in a relationship when one person wants to talk and one doesn't. He also said that men are like rubber bands and women are like waves. So men being rubber bands means they will pull away, but they always snap back. Eventually they can only go so far, or they only tend to go so far, versus women tend to be more like waves where they kind of ebb and flow in their levels of connection. So just again, some kind of stereotypical patterns, but both of these books talk a lot about this idea of very gendered, stereotypical communication between men and women. Now, I want you to think about this a little bit more, because we're gonna, I have a couple of clips to play for you, but I want to talk about it too a little more. And I think this is a great example right? So you left the dishes in the living room, the garage is a mess. You never listen to my opinions. Half the time you don't even look at me when we talk. Translator, you didn't notice her haircut, right? Like, and this is such a common thing. Again, all these issues tend to come up in friendships, relationships within our families. So I want you to think just for a minute, find a few people around you. You don't have to write it down, but just kind of think about it. What are some of the ways that men tend to communicate, like stereotypically? What do they focus on, or how do you communicate with men? And then same for women. And then you could think about maybe how those might butt heads a little bit in a relationship. So I'll give you a few minutes and then we can talk about it together. What are some things that men tend to do stereotypically in terms of communication, or how you have to be with men and talking to them? Same with women, and then maybe some issues that could cause. So find a few people, you could jot it down if you want, or just remember, and then we'll talk about it together.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, you can always join us. Like I'm making.
Yeah. I feel like stereotypically like better. Typically more people like. Yeah. Yeah. No, I can. For me personally, why am I like I feel like we know what's much better. Better. Yeah, like how we're doing right now. Which is like, it's a stereotypically like thing, but it's also like something. I could see that. It's people kind of like
So we'll talk together a couple more minutes.
Yeah, also one point that we kind of want to women might work on one group because they don't really want to like point to more like but like it's all yeah, that's and it's like the man that like the man's like alpha and feedback for this guy. So you see it, when it's work, especially with serious topics. Put some kids, like what your kids, everything in a relationship, everything just often try not to talk about it. It should be good.
all they wanted to do is force they contact one thing, the rest kind of just force the unconditional. Yeah, it's too hard, so. Yeah.
Yeah, actually.
Oh, you know what?
My dad was in his boss.
So, yeah, say one thing, but also. My mom said, right?
Exactly. I said, yeah, definitely.
So it's kind of
Yeah,
like,
right.
he doesn't.
Yeah, I think that the other person doesn't.
Together, because I would love to hear what you, I really badly want to hear what you came up with. Let's start with the first one, right? Anything that you came up with, like how men tend to communicate or how you have to communicate with men, like, let's start with that one. Any thoughts there? You want to start us off? Like, what are some male communication things? Yeah.
I feel like men tend to be very blunt and like very surface level things, like when we're, especially when we're talking to each other.
Yeah.
They just kind of say what's on their mind. They don't dig any deeper. There's no subtlety at all.
Right, okay, so no subtlety, blunt, kind of saying what they mean, like right on the surface, right? Okay, especially between two men.
When they typically when men hang out alone, we need a different activity to be doing in order to talk to each other. Like they'll watch like a football game or something to distract, to kind of like make it easier to talk to each other.
Okay, so you need something to help facilitate that.
Yeah.
Right, I like that, right? Okay, yeah.
Sometimes, at least I know, like for me, when I communicate, I think about like other people's feelings and I try to be very like, I don't, like, this is how you said this to me, that's how I felt it came across for them, if that was your intention.
Sure.
Whereas I feel like sometimes men, like, they don't necessarily think about like the other person is feeling,
Mhm.
and they're just like, well, you said this, and like, that's it, and that's how it was.
Okay, so kind of oblivious to
Yeah.
the feelings or not considering them necessarily, right? Again, and we're dealing in stereotypes, this may or may not be true, but yeah, right, that's a very common stereotype, yeah.
They're not so tactful when they're speaking to people.
Sure.
They're not thinking about it. Then they're
Yeah.
just like you said, like blunt, like this is what I'm thinking about, but they're not really considering how that's gonna be like taken.
Yeah, so maybe even like speaking without thinking about it, right, like as well, yeah.
I don't know if this is just me, but my grandpa does this, and a lot of men that I speak to do this, where you'll say something and then they'll say no, and then basically reword what you said.
Yeah,
So like that test was really difficult. No, it was just like the questions were worded really hard, and like you're like, I agree with you, and they're like,
right.
no, it's just like explain what you said but reword it.
Right.
It's for sure.
Yeah, let me mansplain it to you, right? Yeah, I mean, that's a very common stereotype too, right? And that again goes back to that like report and contest of like, no, let me put it in my terminology, right? But same thing that you just said, right? Like literally, but no, it's this. I like that. Yeah.
A lot of the times, because women tend to be more subtle about communicating certain things, they'll kind of expect the other person to just know what
Yeah.
they're talking about, and it's more of a like, not like expecting you, like no one's expecting me to actually read my mind, but it's like it makes sense to me, like logical sense to
Sure.
me, but it won't make logical sense to my partner. You know what I mean? So like that's why I'm like, it's so like, how do you not know what I'm talking about? They're like,
Right.
you know what I mean? So
Completely missed it.
yeah, exactly. So like you just expect the other person to know.
Sure, right, and that's kind of like blending them all, I love it, right, that's a very common like male, female struggle, right, like how do you not know, right? Reminds me, I have these friends and they got in this huge fight at Christmas time over something like exactly like that, right? She looked at her husband and she's like, I don't want anything for Christmas this year. I don't know if you can see where this is going already, right? She's like, I don't want anything for Christmas, like we really should save money. And so he took her at her word and didn't get her anything for Christmas. We're like, Steven, dude, she doesn't mean it. You gotta get her something for Christmas. And he's like, no, she said, she doesn't want anything for Christmas. And we're like, you're gonna regret this, man. Like, get her something for Christmas. Like, we know her too. Like, she doesn't mean that. And he's like, well, no, but like, if I get her something, then she'll be mad at me. I'm like, yeah, but if you don't get her something, she's gonna be mad at you too. And he's like, well, I can't win, so I'm just not gonna buy her anything. It's way less effort. And I'm like, oh no, you're just running right into it. So we bought her nothing, right? And she was pissed. We fought for weeks. She's like, how did you not get me a present? And you told me not to get you a present. Well, I didn't mean it. Of course, like you should know that I want a present for Christmas, right? Like at least something, if you like loved me at all, you would know me well enough to know that. And he's like, but you said X, poor guy. I was so confused. It was hilarious on the outside, probably not at all funny within the relationship. But it's such a common fight of like, I said X. Well, yeah, but there's subtext underneath it, or like, you should know me better than.
I think when I said that, so.
Right. Yeah, well, money was tight then, but it's better now, and you should have known that. And I like, it just like all the little layers of complication. Yeah.
I mean, if everyone just talked like a therapist,
Uh-huh.
like, tell me more about that. I heard you say.
How did that make you feel?
I heard you say that.
Yeah.
I would like eliminate half of you.
Can you imagine? So what I'm hearing you say is that you don't. Right? She said yes, and be like, I checked with you. But yeah, that, I mean, that would be. It would eliminate some issues and cause all new ones at the same time. Yeah,
I think women tend to overthink a lot of little details and subtleties.
sure.
And they kind of build up like in the picture, like he's walking in front of me, like he never walks by my side, or like, you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
little tiny things. There's this video, people have probably seen it, and it's like, he hasn't talked to me all day, da, 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 and then it goes to the guy's internal monologue, and it's like, I wonder if I could take a bear in a fight. I wonder if he's not on the same wavelength at all, like
Right.
not realizing there's a problem or that she's feeling unheard. And
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's such a big thing, right? Like, and on just completely different wavelengths, like not even aware of it. Yeah.
This is a little random, but I was telling Andrea I'm gonna share this because I think it's really funny.
Okay, let's hear it.
My ex-girlfriend was in this same class, but it was like an anthropology class instead of a psychology class. And she told me that, everybody's thinking
It's because you made us all so interested. What's happening? Yeah.
she told that we descended, which I knew this, but we descended from chimps. And chimps and bonobos, like the other type of monkey, they used to be the same species, but then they speciated, and we descended from the chimpanzee side.
Okay.
And chimps, when they communicate, they fight, like they like throw things, and like that's how they solve conflict.
Yeah.
And they're a patriarchal society, so like as a patriarchal society, that's how we solve conflicts. Like we have wars and we fight. Whereas bonobos are a matriarchal society, and they take like emotion and like feelings and stuff more into account, and they have sex when they fight. Like that's how they solve conflict. So my ex-girlfriend said to me,
Sorry.
so if my ex-girlfriend said to me, like, if we had descended from bonobos instead of like chimps,
Yeah.
or just be like big. And I think that's like really interesting. I don't know, I just wanted to.
The whole thing is interesting, right? Because so much of this gendered stuff does come from like an evolutionary perspective, right? And we see a lot of similarities in animal behaviors between like male and female differences and things that are evolution in nature as well. It is an interesting thought, right? If we weren't so male dominated, can you imagine instead of wars, just a giant war? That's a funny thought to have, right? But I mean, there's a lot of truth in like some of those origins of our behavior. It's interesting. It's super related. I love it. Thank you for sharing. What about some female stuff? We should on men for a minute. Any female communication patterns or that we want to say? Sure. I'll share one with you to start, right? It's my favorite one that my partner does. So I tend to communicate very stereotypically in like a male fashion. Like if I had to pick one of these sides, like I'm sure that's not super surprising, but like I tend to communicate more stereotypically male, but then I have like a lot of like female sensitivity behind it, right? But my partner will sometimes do the whole like, I'm fine kind of thing, or anything is fine, right? That indirect fine, I hate the word fine. You know what fine stands for, right? You all know that acronym, the fucked up, insecure, neurotic, and emotional. That's what fine stands for in the therapeutic stance. So I feel so bad that I swear. So the other day, this was like literally Saturday, right? Where do you want to go to dinner? This is my least favorite conversation to have in my house, right? I have a house of females, all of us, right? I have 3 daughters, I have a female partner, I even have female cats, right, down the line, and right, there's one boy cat, one boy in the house, poor guy. So we go to have this conversation, where do you want to go to dinner tonight? I ask this question, right? My partner says anywhere's fine. Like, oh, fuck, right? Like, I'm screwed. I hate this conversation. I already went out, right? I was like, okay, how about Topper sounds really good. Really in the mood for pizza. Okay. How about Don Cuco's? How about Mexican food? No, it doesn't sound very good either. Right? I'm like, you said anywhere was fine. In my mind. I'd say that. Smarter than that. And so I proposed like 3 other places. I was like, what about TGIF? They're last. Like, okay, how about this? How about that? I list like 15 places, 15. I got for all of them. I was like, how about you give me 3 choices, 2 choices, and I'll pick. No, you think I'm fine with anyone. Are you though? Are you? Like, literally, like 20 minutes later, I'm like, how about we let the kids? Just let the kids, right? Another. She's like, no. It's like, well, then wherever you want to go is fine. Legitimately, right? And like, it wasn't a fight, but it's like one of those conversations. Anything is fun. I'm like, oh God, please don't say the F word, right? Like, that's the F word that I heard. So kind of not saying what you mean, I would say is one that I always think of first, right? Especially with the dinner. The dinner communication, right? This is my least favorite. Yeah.
So I hate this woman, but I feel like I become such a people pleaser because I don't like conflict.
Yeah.
So I just feel like I'm fine with anything.
Yeah.
Just to be like, I don't want to decide and have you be like, ew, that's disgusting.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I kind of just like leave it to go.
Totally common too. Another very common circle of like, I'll do whatever because I don't want to cause issues, right? Again, kind of passive, a little bit more passive role. What are some other things here? Yeah.
Kind of talking about like from woman to woman, you tend to like prep their feelings before you like you're like, this might come off like I'm hating you, or like this might come off like offensive, and then you say it. With a guy, you can like say something and then it's like you read them for a second, you're like, okay, are you offended or not? And then you can like backtrack and try to explain. But
Right.
with a girl, you do it beforehand.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I like that, right? That kind of more sensitive to the feelings to the point where like you're prepping.
Yeah. Versus
Versus like, oh, well, if I offended you, we'll deal with it then.
Yeah.
And we can go back. And we'll get through it, right? I like that. That's a good one. Other ones? What else? Yeah.
I feel like a big one is what's wrong, nothing.
Oh,
And then like you turn your legs away in the car from them.
I love how you model it. Yeah, I don't like that one. Like, what's wrong? Nothing. It's
It's a
like,
big turn.
yeah. And you're like, but I could see it all over your face and all over your body language. But no, nothing. Nothing. Okay. Like nothing is fine. Those are dangerous words. Yeah.
They don't care that or maybe people have supposed
Sure.
or like men's. Like when my mom was still in this, when I was gone for a month from my house and I was telling my mom, oh, I miss you. And she's like, oh, I miss you too, and all this stuff. And then my brother was, oh, when I was gone from him, or she asked him that, and he was like, yeah, I guess I'd like miss hanging out.
Right, like after you put it in a different way, right? Like more open to sharing those emotions. There were a couple other kids, yeah.
I kind of wanted to, something reminded me earlier when you should have saw those images.
Yeah.
So I just thought something that I could relate to, me and my partner, so he always likes it really cold, like in his car, in his house, like everything is freezing.
Sure.
And I hate it. And so, but I compromise. And so what I do is like just be uncomfortable. And so I
Compromise and be uncomfortable.
sit there like this often because I'm just cold and I'm comforting myself. Like and I like come and sit in the car and I'm just like, why are you mad? And I'm like, what? Like, what are you saying? This happens every time. Every
Yeah.
time I tell him, like I'm cold, okay? And he every single time he's like, but you're pressing your arms. Like,
I'm
does
cold.
not understand that, like,
Sure.
He's like, well, you want
Yeah.
or like,
Whoopsie, I did it too.
something. I just think it's hilarious because it's an actual thing that
Yeah.
like I deal with throughout my day. Like, it's not annoying or anything. I just think it's funny. It's like,
Yes.
Automatically, like, that's the only thing that this can mean is
Right.
that you're pissed.
I learned a long time ago that means you're angry and I'm holding on to it. Right?
Exactly.
I mean, I stand like that a
Like,
lot.
like,
Like, it's
tell
just
it, like, going back to this is what I'm telling you, so that's what I'm taking it as like,
Yeah.
face value, but it's like that's not what it is. It's just face
Mhm.
value.
I love it. It's a great example, right? And I mean, like, I tend to stand like that a lot just because I don't know, I find it comfortable, but it can also mean that you're angry. Yeah. Uh-huh. Right? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
When it comes to like building friendships, like
Sure.
2 of my best friends are guys, and then I have another best friend who's a girl, but we don't hang out like as a group and they don't know each other. So like I'll be hanging out with the 2 guys and they're like, they'll make fun of me or like tease me in a way, and it's like I'm the same way with them, you know?
Yeah.
And when I'm like with my girl best friend, we're like so overly sweet to each other.
Sure.
Like, I don't know, I feel like guys like they build friendships by like being kind of mean, but like in a playful way. And,
Yeah. Totally. Right. Very different styles, right? There was another hand. Yeah.
take advantage of their body language and like they kind of embrace it. And because of that, and I feel like guys don't, like, as much as they can't hide their body language, they're not like using it to their advantage. And I feel like as a woman, because that you're reading a guy's body language, and then if you like confront him about it, he's like, what? But like if you're mad, you're gonna turn and like that's what you're doing. You're like, yeah, I'm turning away from you on purpose. So you can
Right.
yeah.
Right. But I loved your turning away over here, right? It's a great example, right? And I think that's a good one too, right? Just the differences in using it and awareness of body language. I mean, there's so many of these, right? And again, they don't always fit men and women, but stereotypically, it's often the case, right? And then when you have 2 people who communicate very differently, regardless of their gender, right, it causes problems, right? And my partner and I have been together 20 years at this point, like 20 years, like we've learned each other's styles, like to the point where typically, I don't know why I didn't do this week, right? But like when my partner says like anywhere's fine, like I usually know right off the bat that like that's not actually the case. I don't know why this week I believed it was different. Like I was like, this is the week, it's fine, right? It's gonna be okay this week. But I mean, like we've learned each other at this point, right? And so oftentimes I'll ask questions like, do you want me to just listen or do you want me to try and fix it? Because I have ideas to fix it, but I can just listen too, right? When you learn somebody, whether it's a friend or a family member or a partner, these things get way easier. Like you become your own translators in a sense when you are familiar with them. But I have some funny clips of these things that I'd like to share with you. There's a lot of like romantic comedy movies that poke fun at this idea. And I have a couple of examples. So I have one for talking to men. And I have one for talking to women. So I'll play both of those for you. The one for talking to men is quite a bit longer, but that's okay. It's pretty comical, I think. So it's from the movie The Ugly Truth, if you've seen that. It is a good example of stereotypical talking to men. Again, stereotypically, right? That's kind of a funny thing that we talk about there, right? And I love these movies for that kind of stuff. Like they're not my favorite type of movies, but there's so many of them that are about gendered communication, about how to attract men, about how to attract women, how to talk to each other. And again, really building on all of these stereotypes. So, and comical. So that was The Ugly Truth and 40-Year-Old Virgin, if you were wondering. Any other thoughts or comments, anything else here or related to the clips? Anything else at all before we keep going? Okay. All right. A couple other things in this chapter. The onion theory of communication, right? So interesting about communicating with people. When we first meet someone, we kind of reveal ourselves in layers, right? Like an onion, right? Think of Donkey from Shrek when I say that, right? He says that too. But we reveal layers at a time. If you reveal too much too quickly, it's a problem. If you don't reveal enough after a time, that can be a problem too. So we tend to start with like very surface level stuff when we meet somebody. And then the closer that we get, the more we reveal, kind of peel back the layers of the onion and increase that intimacy in layers. And again, too much too early can be a problem. I always think of, I think it's Baby Mama. There's a scene in the beginning where they're dating and she just spills everything about wanting to have kids and get married and do all this stuff right off the bat. And he literally like runs out of the restaurant, right? Like too much too fast scares people away. But if you don't reveal enough, then people can also be scared away, feeling like you're not getting closer. A big part of communication too is also talking about things like your sexual history and sexual preferences. Now, this is something a lot of people don't love to do, right? It can be a little bit of a challenging conversation for some people, but it's so important. If you don't talk to people about what you like and what you don't like, and in this case, we're talking about like sexual intimacy, what you like and don't like, it can cause all sorts of issues. Then you're going off of like past relationships and assumptions, and rather than what they might actually enjoy or not enjoy. So it's really important to learn how to make requests and tell people what you like or don't like, to promote that self-disclosure, having empathy for a partner when they tell you what they like or don't like. And again, talking about, maybe like your past and your sexuality and your interest in that area as well, which isn't always the most comfortable, but it's really important. And I have one more clip for you today that is about this. It's such a great example of this. If you've seen the movie I Love You, Man, there's a whole conversation about oral sex that comes up at an awkward dinner party here that relates to this, and I'll play it for you. They didn't talk about this, right? So her ex didn't enjoy having like oral sex, right? So she assumes that he doesn't either, right? And something that he was frustrated enough about to vent to his friend and have brought up at an incredibly awkward dinner. But it comes up and then they talk about it and they can work through it, right? So as uncomfortable as these conversations can be, and I think his look sums it up really well. When he like looks away like all like in pain, like that's kind of the attitude that most people have when it comes to talking about like previous sexual relationships with people. Like most people don't want to know about it. You don't want to think about it. You don't want to talk about it. But when you don't, it can lead to issues too, right? So something that's important to talk about, even if it's not always the most comfortable. So revealing yourself in layers, and also including talking about like intimacy and sexual communication as well. One more slide in this chapter, some unsuccessful communication patterns. Two very famous therapy people that did a lot of couples therapy, Gottman and Gottman. Gottman and his wife, right, a team of therapists that are married to each other, studied a lot of couples. Now these two are like the big people in the name of like couples therapy in the therapeutic field. And what they did is they coined what they called the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse in relationships. Now, the horsemen of the apocalypse is that like metaphor of like the end of days or the end of times, right, in the Bible, right? And so what Gottman and Gottman believed is that if a couple shows all 4 of these things in an interview or in a like therapy session, that it indicated like the end of the relationship is on its way unless you address it. So if you have these things in a relationship, don't think you're doomed, but you do need to typically fix them or they can become bigger issues. So these 4 things, which would be a great short answer question for you, like what are the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, according to Gottman and Gottman, signaled like the issues in a relationship. So criticism, contempt, defensiveness, and stonewalling. So if you're doing all 4 of these, it can be very problematic. So obviously criticism is when you attack your partner's like personality or character, right? When you're criticizing them as a person, especially when you say stuff like you always do X or you never do X, right? And so it's making everything like big and global and personality related rather than like, hey, you didn't do X today, right? It's like you always or you never. Kind of attacking a person's character. Contempt is when you have like an intent to harm, like in a sense you are attacking their sense of self. You have an intention to harm them like physically or psychologically. So it's saying stuff like doing stuff like rolling your eyes is a big sign of contempt. I love how she's rolling her eyes. I look like this one down here is going to eat the person next to her. Like she looks all animal like. Defensiveness is when you always see yourself as the victim. This is a really big one that can cause problems in fights. Like if somebody is complaining about something or voicing something, and you turn it around and get defensive rather than hearing. This is something that I tend to do. It's something I have to always work on in a fight. Like just listen, don't like be defensive, right? Like it's something for me, I always have to remind myself, like don't get defensive, just like validate and hear first, and then I can counter, right? Because if you're always seeing yourself as the victim and you turn it around, and somebody's like, well, you know, I don't feel like you listen to me, and you counter with like, well, you never listen to me, right? That would be being defensive. And that can be a big problem as well. You're not listening if you're turning it around. And then stonewalling, when you remove yourself from the relationship as a way to avoid conflict. So maybe somebody's really upset and you just become like a frozen ice wall, like Elsa, right? You just get completely closed off and cold and you refuse to talk to them. Now that's okay for a short time if you need a minute to like process and deal with things. But if you're refusing and withdrawing from a relationship, that can be a problem, right? And so having all four of these, especially frequently, can be a big issue when it comes to like relationship patterns, and they require fixing according to Gottman and Gottman. All right. Any other thoughts, comments, anything else related to communication? Any other like stories or thoughts or anything that came up in your mind? Yeah.
Therapist once told me going over this, that the real sign that there's probably at least one person in a relationship is apathy.
Yeah. Yeah.
You just stop caring about all that.
Right. Yeah. And it's almost a degree of like stonewalling, right? When you have checked out and you just don't care anymore, right? That can be a real indicator that like it's over if somebody doesn't care, right? And again, if you have these things, you can still fix them, right? But they do require fixing, or it leads to things like apathy and an end of a relationship. Anything else? Other thoughts? The next chapter that we'll look at is chapter 7. Yeah.
Are these things just, I guess, socially based? Like, is this just primarily just through observation?
Yeah.
Is there like a behavior, like a psychological or genetic reasoning for these things?
For these.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just like with the stereotypes of the way that women and men tend to behave.
Yeah, I mean, so it's interesting what perspective you look at it from, right? So from an evolutionary perspective, like we look at like, again, trends that have come from like animal behaviors and like patterns throughout time. But a lot of it is socialized, right? It's thought to be socialized because it can be very different from place to place. Like different cultures have different levels of sensitivity, different levels of like masculinity and femininity, or even like other that is more recognized. So a lot of it is very culturally constructed, which is interesting, and reinforced by stereotypes, right? Like it just keeps getting like reinforced and reinforced. So, I mean, some of it is a little bit like you could argue that it's somewhat evolutionary and genetic, but you could also argue that it's very socially constructed. So it's kind of a bit of both. And then I thought you were talking about these specifically. These were things that were observed through like their research that were correlated with relationships breaking up. So they don't necessarily cause it, but there was a high connection between the two. So what we'll do, I'll stop here rather than start for like 4 minutes, but we will look at chapter 7, which has to do with falling in love. So that'll be our topic for next week. We'll talk about love and intimacy and the chemicals involved with love. Don't forget about the homework assignments. Start working on that over the weekend. A lot of them do require a little like activity or trip. So be thinking about that on Monday. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay cool with the hot weather we're gonna have, sadly. And I'll see you all on Monday.